The subject of intonation is one of the most important aspects of any bassist craft. A bassist can have a big, beautiful sound, great time, and have an advanced vocabulary of musical ideas. But if all of these things can't be executed with good intonation, the end result will be lacking. At best, the listener will think, yeah, but, and at worst, they might not want to listen at all just because all of these otherwise positive things are soured due to them all sounding out of tune. The subject of what it is to be in tune is complicated by hundreds of years of tuning systems and theories known as temperaments, each created with different ends in mind. These systems sport names like Pythagorean, mean tone, just intonation, and equal temperament, among many others, and we'll have more on this in a second. As we'll see later, these systems are all basically scientific theories of intonation based on interval ratios, so basically math. And for some of the intervals in these systems, some very, very dense math. If you open up the tuning window on any Logic software synth, you'll find a bewildering array of historical tuning systems to choose from. 107 different tuning systems to be exact, but who's counting? Each of these is based on a different mathematical principle and with different ratios for intervals. On the flip side of the coin, intonation can also be viewed as an extremely simple concept, much like the infamous 1964 definition of obscenity issued by Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, which was, "I know it when I see it," or in the case of music, "I know it when I hear it." This is the intuitive approach to intonation. The remainder of this video series will be an attempt to reconcile these two extremes into something hopefully very practical and useful. To illustrate the differences between these two approaches, consider the following two requests. 1. Given a drone note, execute a note with a vibrational ratio of 6:5 in relation to the drone. 2. Play a minor third above the drone. So in just intonation, which is one of the two most common tuning systems in use today, these two requests amount to the difference between 6 and a half dozen. But here, the first request sounds like something that would tax the human brain immensely to contemplate, while the second sounds like a simple request that our brains can absolutely accomplish. So how can we, as practicing musicians, train ourselves to bring these two worlds together to accomplish the ratios that intervals represent without having to crunch these numbers in real time like a human computer? Well, the remainder of this first installment in the series will offer a shallow peek into just the very top of the opening of the very, very deep rabbit hole that interval ratios represent and what they mean for us as practicing musicians. In order to do this, we need to understand how the different interval types represent different mathematical ratios of each note to the other, and how those ratios represent themselves as sound. The two basic types of intervals are consonant intervals and dissonant intervals. Consonant intervals can be further divided into perfect consonances and imperfect consonances. Broken down in this way, the intervals look like this. Perfect consonances are the unison, the octave, the perfect fifth, and the perfect fourth. Imperfect consonances are the major sixth, the major third, the minor sixth, and the minor third, while dissonances include the major second, the minor seventh, major seventh, minor second, and the tritone. The ratio after each interval shows the interval expressed as a mathematical formula in just intonation. And as we go down the list from consonances to dissonances, these ratios look more and more intimidating to our brains. They also become more difficult to intonate precisely because consonances represent simpler interval ratios and dissonances increasingly complex ones. We won't cover each interval ratio in depth, but it's important to understand from the beginning that the relationships of simultaneously sounding pitches are basically polyrhythms, with the first number of the ratio representing the upper or the faster note of an interval, and the second number representing the lower or slower note. So what does that actually mean? Well, the vibrational frequency of any note in any interval is mathematically expressed in hertz or cycles per second. In English, if you're playing the note A1, the frequency of that note is 55 hertz, which means that the string is vibrating 55 times per second. The pitch A2, an octave above, would vibrate at 110 hertz, a ratio of 2 to 1. And a perfect fifth above that original A1, the note E2, would vibrate at 82.5 hertz because 3 is 1.5 times 2, and 1.5 times 55 equals 82.5. The math behind all of the more complex ratios works out in the same basic way, but fortunately, we don't need to cover all of this complex math in detail in order to understand the basic principle. One thing that really helped these ratios make sense to me on both logical and on intuitive levels is that the perfect intervals are made up of simple ratios that most musicians could easily execute as polyrhythms. So for example, the octave is a 2-to-1 ratio. As a rhythm, the perfect fifth is a 3-to-2 ratio as a rhythm. The perfect fourth is a 4-to-3 ratio. And even the first couple of imperfect consonant intervals are made up of rhythms that are not terribly uncommon in Western music. So, for example, the major sixth is a 5/3 rhythm. And the major third is a 5/4 rhythm. The following screenshot demonstrates how each of these polyrhythms would look and sound like in standard notation. To follow the cursor as it tracks the music, it would be a good idea to expand to full screen for this example. But beyond these relatively simple polyrhythms, most musicians would not be able to easily tap the polyrhythms of the intervals further down the list, and the further down you go, the more complex the ratios get. Imagine going to an audition and being asked to tap 45 in one hand against 32 in the other. Yeah, bet I do. And yet, this is the ratio we create every time we play an augmented fourth. To see and hear how polyrhythmic ratios become sounding intervals, watch the following 1-minute screenshot. In it, we'll see and hear the sound of a 5/4 polyrhythm in a stereo waveform editor. After about 8 seconds of that, we'll speed up the sample by a factor of 5 and play it again. See the notes before each sample is played for details on the increase in metronome tempo. After a few rounds of this, we'll no longer hear the rhythm itself, but we'll instead hear the interval of a major third. And at that point, we'll double the speed of that sample to show how doubling the frequency transposes the pitch of the interval up an octave, because remember, the octave is a 2-to-1 ratio. As you watch the short example and listen to the transforming sound, resist the temptation to dismiss the intermediate steps as mere annoying noise. The reason is that as we move forward, we'll be trying to lock in with the beat patterns of each interval to find the point where the rhythmic and sonic turbulence between the two notes is as slow as possible. This is what we will call the sweet spot in part 2 of this series. So now that we've stared into the mathematical abyss and recoiled in fascination, horror, or both, the question becomes, how can we use this information in a more intuitive way? We'll start by distilling the myriad different tuning systems down into the two most essential systems in use today, just intonation, and equal temperament. The beauty of just intonation is that it distills the interval ratios down into their simplest and most elegant mathematical forms, which to me is why just intonation is synonymous with the term pure intonation, which is how I learned it way back in the day. Most players of non-equal tempered instruments intuitively tend to hear just intervals as the most intuitively pure version of each interval, and the version that their ear guides them to by instinct. These will be the intervals that have the slowest beat patterns, which I like to think of as sonic turbulence, between the two notes. By contrast, equal temperament is a tuning system that evolved to facilitate playing in all keys on keyboard instruments. Before its introduction, a keyboard tuned in any other tuning system would sound increasingly out of tune if the music being played was in any other key than the key the instrument was originally tuned for. The idea behind equal temperament is to divide the octave equally into 12 half steps comprised of units called cents, so that all keys would end up equally in tune. It worked for this purpose, and keyboards and fretted instruments to this day are designed to utilize this system, which is why a player playing them can play music in any key equally in tune. The compromise made, however, is that with the exception of the octave, every other interval would be slightly out of tune in relation to just intonation. As we move forward in our study of intonation, it'll be important to be able to understand and hear the sound of intervals in both systems of intonation. But as we'll see in part 2 of this series, since most people intuitively gravitate towards just intervals as being more in tune, it will really benefit us to learn to hear the sound of these intervals clearly and quickly. In the next segment, I'll use a tuning app to play the sound of each of the intervals, arranged from the most consonant to the most dissonant. And of course, most dissonant is slightly subjective, but the ordering given here are my choices. While listening to each interval, I'll let the just interval play for a few seconds, then toggle back and forth between the interval in just intonation and then the same interval in equal tempered tuning. Pay attention to the difference, because the essence of the sweet spot method of intonation rests on our ability to hone in on the purest version of every interval so we can learn to practice finding it quickly. I'm pretty sure that in toggling back and forth, you may be tempted to wince at the sonic sourness of many of the tempered intervals. Embrace that physical reaction. It will point you in the right direction as we move forward. As this example proceeds, with the exception of the octave, every other interval will sound less pure and equal temperament than it does in the just intonation system. The key to absorbing the essence of each interval is to listen to the beating or turbulence between the two notes, and to notice that the beating is faster and more pronounced in the equal tempered version. Try to train your ear to find and embrace that turbulence. Hearing that part of the interval sound quickly and clearly is the key to improving intonation in the long run. As the example plays, watch the upper left-hand corner of the screen to see when the interval has changed from the just version to the equal tempered one. I'll let each version play for a bit to give the viewer a chance to really listen deeply to the sound of each, and to hopefully get better at honing in on the beat patterns for each interval. To really hear the beating of the turbulence in each interval, I recommend using headphones during this part of the presentation. And just as a note, as this part of the presentation proceeds, disregard any activity in the middle circle of the tuner screen. It's not reacting to the notes it's playing, but rather trying to track passing traffic on my street. we've heard the just and equal tempered versions of every interval side by side, we can make a few observations. First, if you felt that listening to intervals in this way is kind of annoying, you are not alone. It's kind of like putting sound under an X-ray machine so that we can see the structures underneath more clearly. And like X-rays, the results can be a little creepy. 2, many people may find that they prefer the sound of some of the equal tempered intervals over the just versions. This is probably because we've all grown up with equal tempered music played all around us on pianos, guitars, and many other instruments. Equal temperament is not some evil enemy, but it is a factor we should learn to understand and cope with as we learn to play more in tune in any situation. And third, most importantly, the big upshot of all of this sort of comparison moving forward is that the just versions of every interval have slower beat patterns between the notes. Technically, this is because the ratios are simple and more rational, but intuitively, this fact gives an extremely clear and useful goal: to be able to play any interval with the slowest possible sonic turbulence for that interval. This is the concept that I think of as the sweet spot, and it will be the main focus of part 2 of this series. Not to worry, in part 2 we'll be focusing more on the practical applications of what we have covered here in actual musical as opposed to theoretical sound. I hope you'll stick around and join me.